right, last one for this unit. Hooray! I'm sure you guys are ready to be done with watching the videos. I'm sure you're ready to be done listening to me talk, period. Just end of story. But uh, yeah, it's the way it is. All right, so today we're going to talk about triangle trade. So this is a three-part voyage, and it's called the triangle trade. You'll see in a second when I show you a map, because it makes a triangle across the Atlantic Ocean. So it's different from the Colonial Exchange, like I talked about earlier in this unit. Colonial exchange was like a two-way street. It's going back and forth between the old world and the new world. Triangle trade is much more specific. Okay, from Europe to Africa goes the manufactured goods, because most, like the factory kind of things where they made things back during this time period, that was in Europe. And so they would take guns and tools and all kinds of different things from Europe down to Africa, and they would sell them into Africa. And with that money, they would purchase enslaved people, and then they would take them across the Atlantic Ocean. This was called the Middle Passage, the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean, and then they would take those enslaved people into North and South America and sell them, and they would use that money then to purchase raw materials like lumber, cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, shipbuilding materials, all kinds of different things. Okay, and then they would take that stuff back to Europe, and they would turn all of these raw materials into manufactured trade goods, and the whole thing would start all over. Okay, and so they'd kind of go back and forth all around the Atlantic Ocean, and lots of people, especially in Europe, made a lot of money off this. Also during this time, just one thing that's of note, we'll talk a little bit more about it in the next unit. There was more conflict between the eastern part of North Carolina and the western part. Like, we were the western part then. The eastern part was, you know, starting to develop quite a bit during this time period, especially as we get closer and closer to the American Revolution. And they were living very different lives from what we were living here in the western part of the state. The western part of the state was pretty much all small farmers, family farmers, that kind of thing. And the eastern part of the state was a lot of bigger kind of plantation agriculture and cities and things like that. So there's just a big cultural divide, and there was some tax disputes that we'll talk about in the next unit as well. But it's just kind of note that the eastern and western part of North Carolina was not getting along during this time period. So here's a kind of a diagram here, a map of the triangle trade. So up here you've got Europe, taking all these manufactured things down to Africa, purchasing enslaved people, taking them across the ocean, selling them into North, South America, and Central America, and then purchasing all kinds of, um, raw materials like indigo and tobacco, and then taking it back to England and selling them throughout Europe from there. Okay, so again, mercantilism basically made it so that England was the only people that could buy from us. They would take all of the stuff that they bought from us back to England, and then they would turn around and sell it to the rest of the European powers. So yes, while we were getting wealthy off this, England was getting significantly more so wealthy off of this, because they kind of controlled the price that they were willing to pay us. And if we wanted to sell it, we had to sell it to England. So you can kind of imagine that probably brought about some resentment here in the colonies towards England and their control over our trade, which we'll see a lot more of in the next unit. So along those same lines, we'll come back to this in the next units, in the next couple units, but this is a diagram of the Middle Passage, how they would transport the enslaved people. You can imagine pretty horrific conditions. Disease spread very quickly in ships like this because the people were so packed in so tight. And so it was pretty arduous, pretty horrendous experience for these people that were coming in from Africa. So we're going to talk about the early government in the colonies here, and you're going to start to see that there's some influence that starts like way back in the 1200s onto what our government becomes today. So this is kind of a long-standing thing, and it does have an impact on us even still to this day. So the first two documents here, the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, what they share in common was that it limited the monarchy's power, so the king or the queen's power, and it gave more power to the people. Now, again, this is still a monarchy during this time. I mean, this is the 1200s and the 1600s, so it's still a really strong monarchy, but it does at least give the power some power to the people in that they get to vote on parliament, so they have representative government. And so we start to kind of develop some ideas here in the colonies based upon these two documents that everybody should follow the same rules in theory, and everybody should have some kind of say in the government. Next one is representative government, which I just mentioned. It's essentially this idea where a group of people get together and they choose someone to represent them in the government. Okay, so like, next month, or I guess in 5 weeks, technically, your parents will go and vote. And the way they vote is, they choose representatives. So you pick somebody that has the same kind of viewpoints on government and taxes and law and whatever, as you. And those people then go and represent your opinions in the government. Okay. So representative government, just basically you're choosing someone to go in and, kind of take a leadership role for you. Okay. Originally here in the colonies, or what becomes the United States, suffrage was limited to white men over the age of 21 that had property. So basically, rich white dudes. And suffrage is just a fancy term for the right to vote. And what you'll see throughout this course is that as you go through time, you see that more and more people gain the right to vote. Okay. And it becomes more and more truly democratic as we get closer and closer to current day. Okay, so originally it was only white guys that were wealthy that owned land could vote, but eventually it transitions to what we have today. Okay, so the voting age changed, the property requirements changed, the race changed, the gender changed, and so we've got a lot more representative government today than what we used to have. So the Mayflower Compact, we already talked about that. That was like the document that the Pilgrims signed, and it was essentially saying, we're so far away from England, we're away from help, so we have to set up our own government here and kind of make our own laws. And it was kind of like, basically like a mini state almost. And so they started their own kind of government there in Massachusetts, and were kind of having their own court system and all that kind of stuff because they were so far from England and so far from Jamestown. So this is kind of the first big deal attempt at self-government here in the colonies. Town meetings, which actually still exist in some parts of New England today, are really cool. It's really a true democracy. Okay, so town meeting is basically where everybody that lived in the town would gather together and vote on things, and they would make a decision based upon everyone's opinion in the town about how to do things, like create a new law or build a new school or raise taxes to build a new road or something like that. Okay, and so there are still parts of New England that have town meetings, like very small towns in Connecticut or New Hampshire, Vermont, that kind of thing. So, but it was the first American government in which all free men could participate. So there was no proper requirement there, which was a pretty big deal for the time. The House of Burgesses, we already talked about. This was the first representative government in Jamestown. And, Jamestown, because it was so focused on tobacco, it requires a lot of land. So the colony became really quickly spread out. It wasn't so like tight-knit town like you would experience in New England. And so they had to have a representative government, because if you wanted to have a town meeting in Jamestown, people would have to travel for miles and miles to get there to vote, and that just wasn't that didn't make any sense. And so they created a representative government, and this becomes kind of like the basis for kind of like for our Congress today. So these are pretty big deals. I mean, I know I'm going through them pretty quick, but these are pretty important things that have happened in the past. And you'll learn a lot more about this when you guys get into high school and you take civics. But so we already talked about proprietary colonies versus royal colonies. A proprietary colony is privately owned. That would be like Virginia originally. The Virginia Company owned Virginia. The United States was started as a company. It wasn't started as like, yay, democracy or anything like that. It was designed and started to make money. That was it, period. And North Carolina was the same way. It was set up as a proprietary colony. Remember that Lords Proprietors, there's 8 dudes that owned it and collected all the taxes off of it. They made a lot of money off this, okay? But eventually most of the colonies transitioned to royal colonies where the king and parliament were collecting taxes off of us and using that money to do all kinds of things, mostly build a huge navy and protect their empire. So that's kind of the end of this unit. So You'll need to make sure that you've completed all of these study guide videos, the guided notes, and completed the guided notes to prepare for the assessment, which we'll talk a lot more about today in class. But in any case, next week starts a new unit. It's a short one. It's all about the cause of the revolution. We're going to do it a little bit differently in the next unit. So, hooray! Hooray! All right.